Greetings, Professor McKee here with the last Seminar Saturdays video for spring. Over the summer I'll be taking off, preparing new papers for the seminar series in the fall. But our last paper today is about social media and Bitcoin. And the paper is called Social Learning and Sentiment Contagion in the Bitcoin Market by Pengfei, Haoyang Liu, and Pengfei. My apologies if I mangled anyone's name. This is a working paper that was presented at AFA in January 2025. So I was there at the presentation, thought it was an interesting paper to look at, and it's kind of on theme with a number of other papers we've talked about this semester as well. We kind of have a social media and investing theme here. So how does social media influence people's investment decisions? Obviously, we're going to focus on Bitcoin, but we've seen a number of papers on how social networks influence economic decisions, including things like investing. This is a widely studied topic. Our week 4, week 6, week 9, and week 11 papers were all about social networks influencing these decisions. And a common limitation for these kinds of papers is that we can't directly observe that there is social interaction happening, and we definitely can't map it to a subsequent investment decision directly. But the authors here have data that they can directly observe the social interactions, and they can also observe trades that happen immediately after the social interaction. And I think that's probably the key contribution that they really bring here, because most of the time we have to sort of assume that the social interactions are happening and that they are influencing the decisions, because we can't observe these things directly. So the setting here is, of course, Bitcoin, as you might know from the title, and they are also using a social media platform called Bitcoin Talk. This is a forum created by the founder of Bitcoin. It's quite large. People who are, of course, investing, trading in Bitcoin are talking on this forum. And as one of the things you can do in this forum is you can voluntarily disclose your Bitcoin wallet. And if you know a lot about how currencies like this work, all the transactions are public. So you'll be able to see if this person is buying or selling Bitcoin, and you'll be able to attach it to actual posts that this forum member is making because they've disclosed what their Bitcoin wallet is. So we can see their actual transactions, at least for some of them, and we can also see prior discussion of Bitcoin and how they think it's going to be going up or going down, that sort of thing, before they make that trade. And this is a voluntary disclosure, but the forum is pushing this disclosure based on like security. So if your Bitcoin wallet gets lost, you'll be able to get it back and not lose your money. So it's not necessarily people like trying to brag about their trades. It's also about a different reason to disclose that is hopefully not closely correlated with their choices in terms of trading. Now, in terms of user sentiment, or what the social network is sort of saying about Bitcoin, they're using a textual analysis of the posts in the forum. And they're using Stanford natural language processing. They take 10,000 sentences randomly selected, and then they manually label those as either positive, neutral, negative, or irrelevant to Bitcoin, and use that as a training sample. They can detect sentences with forward-looking statements, and they combine this all together to get us either positive, negative, neutral, or nothing sentiment for forward-looking statements about Bitcoin. Now, as the discussant for this paper pointed out when I saw this paper presented, AI models can probably do this, probably do it better than the NLP. Papers tend to take several years, especially if they're going to the top conferences like this. So they probably started this paper before AI became widely available, and now this AI is sort of supplanting the methodology that they're using here. So the discussant was apologetic, but he basically said, you probably should just redo this using AI. They also have some things like traditional news about Bitcoin, so traditional news stories from Ravenpack, Google searches for interest in Bitcoin, and of course they have market data on Bitcoin price, volatility, through their range of data 2012 through 2022. Their measure that they're looking at in terms of how they get a measure of sentiment that is influencing a single user is they rely on pairs of posts. So the person posts in a thread in the forum, and then within a 24-hour period, that person makes another post in the same thread. And they have 300,000 pairs because this is a pretty large forum, and their measure of sentiment change is the change in sentiment between the first post and the second post. So if the first post is positive about Bitcoin, the second post is negative about Bitcoin, then that's a negative change in sentiment. So they're looking at the sentiment change, and then the social sentiment, this basically the variable they're interested in, this is the sentiment of all the people posting in between that pair. So you post, a bunch of other people start talking about Bitcoin too, saying various positive or negative things about it, and then you post again. So if you have positive social sentiment, your second post is more likely to be positive as well. Now, unsurprisingly, the actual return of Bitcoin that day is much more powerful than the people you're talking to, but they still show up as well. And it's not even just the overall forum. They have sentiment for just all posts in that forum, not posts that you are seeing because you are participating in this thread. So posts by other users do seem to change or be associated with a change in sentiment for a user. Now, there could be some omitted variables that are affecting both your initial poster sentiment as well as the other poster sentiments. Obviously, Bitcoin's price movement would be a big candidate here, but they control for that. The problem with just trying to include all the right control variables is there's always other things you could have included that you didn't think of. And referees, especially reviewer 2, is really good at thinking of new things you should have included. So the authors follow a test proposed by Oster in 2019 paper. This is, if you're familiar with parenting, this is the same Emily Oster who has a book on parenting used based on economic research. She knows econometrics too, apparently. And the idea is that if your existing control increases R² significantly without affecting our coefficient of interest, in this case it would be our social sentiment variable, then adding more controls is not going to affect your variable of interest. I am not an econometrics expert here, so I'm not super familiar with how this test would work. As far as I can tell, they do the test that Oster proposes. They find that they add all these controls. If you go back, you can see that there's fixed effects, there's all these different controls here, and you can see the R² does not budge. 0.34 no matter what they do. So according to the authors, this means they're not having a problem with omitted variable bias. I do not know if that's correct or not, but that's their argument. And that's probably the main way. So they don't really have an exogenous shock here. They are mostly relying, I think, on this. So they're really heavily focusing on the Oster sort of proposed test here. And if you believe Oster, then this paper is probably okay. If you don't believe Oster, this paper is not going to be okay. Now, there's also potential selection bias because posters aren't forced to post. You're certainly not forced to post again. You can post in one thread, and then maybe you only post again if everyone else agrees with you, because people don't like it when people disagree with them usually. Now, one way to get around it is that the posters could have their Bitcoin wallet linked, in which case we can see if they make trades, even if they don't actually make posts. And honestly, I feel like the trades are more useful, because talk is pretty cheap, especially on anonymous internet forums. But actually putting money down and buying and selling Bitcoin, that's, well, you're putting your money where your mouth is, quite literally. Now, of course, their entire sample is potentially non-representative in other ways. After all, not everyone posts on a Bitcoin online forum. Maybe other people trading in Bitcoin are different. But setting that aside, I think when they look at the trades themselves versus the changes in sentiment, that is probably less problematic in terms of selection bias. Now, in terms of actual trading, so what they found is that the probability of you buying the next day, if you're exposed to positive sentiment because people were saying positive things about Bitcoin after your first post, that goes up. So you are more likely to buy. They have various controls in it. Again, R-squared is not changing very much. And they also test a lot of kind of subsample tests involving things like the characteristics of the posters. So they test if there's something different about posters that are sort of power users versus more infrequent posters. And it seems like people that post more are not as influenced by social sentiment. You can see that the magnitude of the number here is smaller, 3.5 versus 2.9. And if you do an interaction of it's a frequent poster and they're affected by social sentiment, that's actually a negative interaction, although it's not significant. Now, they defined frequent versus infrequent and just as saying you're posting more or less than the population average for the forum itself. But despite being a frequent poster, you still appear to be affected by social sentiment. So it's not like it makes you immune. Now, are some other users potentially more resistant? Maybe ones that are better informed or trust the forum less versus just posting a lot? So they looked at a couple different measures for users. So they have new users versus ones with a legendary status. I'm not quite sure what that means. It's some sort of status that you have within the forum. You have a special title next to your name, your username, or something like that. They looked at network centrality, so how central users were to other posters. If they participate in lots of threads or they participate in threads with lots of participants, then you have higher network centrality. And they also looked at how informed the traders were, the users were. So they looked at the sentiment, and they use the correlation of the sentiment with future Bitcoin returns. The ones that have very low correlation, so bottom 25%, are the very low, not very informed users. They're very, very clearly wrong. Now, I'm not quite sure why they picked 1 week or bottom 25%. There's no, as far as I can tell, clear reason why. What they end up finding is that, yes, there is some influence here. It seems like the less informed users are more strongly impacted. The network users are maybe a little bit less strongly impacted, and non-legendary users are more strongly impacted. But you're still seeing some impact from social sentiment despite being more informed. So newer, less experienced, less informed traders or posters were affected more, but not necessarily. It doesn't necessarily completely protect you. And then they look at when learning happens. Does it all happen on all days, or is it only on some days? Maybe it's high information days where some big news happen. Maybe it's only on slow days where there's no competing influences on you, so you're just going off the vibes from the social sentiment you're seeing. They're going to use Ravenpack to look at for big news. Or maybe it's based on volatility in the underlying asset. There's a lot of uncertainty about Bitcoin price. Maybe that's when you use social sentiment more. Well, on informative days, so there's big information happening, nothing really seems to happen here. There's nothing special about those days. But when there's high uncertainty and high volatility in terms of the underlying asset, then you're seeing a bigger effect from social sentiment. And they're splitting their samples at median now for uncertainty and volatility, and in informative days. Okay, so next they look at Bitcoin returns. If you are affected by social learning, does it help you? If you trade in this, would you benefit or be harmed? And does it affect the Bitcoin market overall? Well, trading on the sentiment would be a bad idea. It's just negative returns, at least in the short term, 6 hours, 1 day, 2 days, several days, a week. You're going to have pretty big negative returns if you just follow social sentiment. And regular news sentiment does not help you. The forum sentiment would be bad to trade on. There's a lot of negative, pretty strongly negative coefficients here. I mean, this kind of implies that if you look at social sentiment and you do the opposite, so if everyone's positive, you would sell Bitcoin, everyone's negative, you buy Bitcoin, you'd probably end up making money. And this is something I've seen before in terms of like retail traders. People in general are really bad at trading, especially on short-term trades, and just trading the opposite of what people are saying is sometimes a really effective strategy, because people are just so badly wrong that they're saying the opposite of what's actually going to happen. And this is true even if you're looking at just informed users. So the legendary users with high centrality, users that are high on being informed, so they're not really bad at predicting. They're better, like their sentiment is less bad than the non-legendary, non-central, uninformed traders. The uninformed traders are really bad, but these ones are still negative. Like they're still going to give you bad information for short-term Bitcoin returns. So why are people still updating with their social sentiment when the social sentiment that they're updating on is pretty bad at predicting the short-term returns here? So they have a couple of potentials here. The big one that they focus on is confirmation bias, so that you are seeking out people that say the things you want to hear. And also that you're potentially selectively interpreting sentiment from the post. So, the Stanford NLP model gives a measure of sentiment, but your measure of sentiment might be different because, you ignore the things you don't want to see and you overemphasize the things you do like. So they look at prior sentiment, which is the sentiment of the first post in the thread. And they're saying, okay, if you have positive sentiment in your first post, are you seeking out threads that start out as positive? So positive prior is the user's first post in its pair, in that person's pair. If it has positive sentiment, it's a 1. And then prior sentiment is the sentiment of the thread itself based on the first post. What they find is, they're connected. Very strong correlation here. If the first post is positive, you're going to have. If your first post is positive, you're very likely posting in a thread that started out with positive sentiment, and there's going to be positive social sentiment too. So again, it appears here that the users are not seeking out contrary views. They're not looking for different information. They're looking for information that is the same as what they currently already think. And if you look at non-positive priors, you don't see the same pattern, right? So if you have positive priors, you're only updating in a positive direction. But if you start out and you're not positive on Bitcoin, sometimes you update in a positive direction, sometimes you update in a negative direction. So users with neutral or negative sentiment update in either direction. Users with positive sentiment in their first post update only in positive direction. This is positive, but it's statistically not significant. And I thought that this was pretty interesting. It kind of shows, I think it helps their case in terms of confirmation bias a lot, just by showing this different effect here, that the people with positive priors and versus non-positive priors are behaving quite differently in how they change in their second post. Then they get to the individual user trading. They don't have very many people, just 2,550. But what they're first going to look at is, do they buy or sell more when they update in response to positive or negative sentiment? And if they have positive sentiment, they're more likely to buy. Okay, yep, they seem to be affected by that. Again, you can note R squared does not really change a lot when we add in all these controls. And the source of the sentiment, so who was it? Was it a legendary? Was it someone who's essential? So someone who's informed or not informed doesn't seem to really matter too much. For instance, both informed and not informed are both positive effects here. A naive, non-legendary user or essential user, apparently legendary users and non-essential users are slightly negative, but hard to know how relevant that is. I don't know how many actual legendary posters there are and how frequently they post. But they're clearly not really very careful at differentiating between people who know what they're talking about and people who really don't know what they're talking about. And was there any signs that the overall market was affected? Well, we have abnormal trading volume and return volatility. So SCI is there as a measure of how many posters were adjusting sentiment. And when there's a lot of posters adjusting sentiment, volume goes up, volatility goes up. And they're controlling for things like the past return, past volatility. So yes, it seems like when there's a lot of people updating on social learning, there are noticeable changes in the market that are happening following that. Now, maybe there's something that affects these people and then also affects trading volume and volatility going forward, but there's a connection there. And then the last things the authors do, they look at bubbles. So when the price increases dramatically 200% plus, or it crashes down in a 5th percentile or worse day, and how that relates to social sentiment. There's a ton of tables. I've gone through a lot of them. There's a lot of tables in this paper. I skipped the safe space. You can look at it yourself if you would like to see it. And to wrap this up, so it appears that there is social learning happening in context of the Bitcoin market. Investors are talking and also trading differently after they're exposed to social sentiment. It's hard to really prove that the sentiment causes it, but we can definitely observe that they're posting in threads, the other people posting are positive, they become more positive because of that. Now, and we also can see that they're doing more trading as well. And unsurprisingly, if you're familiar with how well retail investors tend to do, especially with short-term trading, the sentiment is really bad. A prediction, frankly, doing the inverse of it might actually be a really good trading strategy for Bitcoin. That's not actual investment advice. That's just my interpretation of the paper. If you go out and try this and it blows up in your face, don't blame me, please. I would not recommend doing day trading of Bitcoin under any circumstances. Day trading itself is a terrible idea, and day trading something as volatile as Bitcoin is even worse than normal. So they do have, looks like, some evidence of selective participation, of confirmation bias, things like that are potentially driving some of this reasons that sentiment's so bad. People are not actually seeking the truth. They're just trying to seek comfort that their beliefs about Bitcoin are correct. And I think this paper, well, it definitely would need to move, AI is going to cause this paper problems because they're not using AI, and AI is an obvious a tool to use in terms of measuring sentiment. The other thing I think this paper needs to be able to do, and I'm not a this is something that, you're going to go to the referee, and if the referee is really good in econometrics, that's what the referee is going to be keen on, is the Oster test, that saying, well, we don't have a problem with admitted variable bias. If the referee believes that, you're good, and you'll probably be okay with this paper. If the referee doesn't believe it, you're going to be in big trouble, I think, because you just don't have much in the way of causality. All right, and that is our last paper for the semester. I'll be posting a new series in the fall once the fall semester starts for me. That'll be probably beginning around September of 2025. And I'll still be making some videos over the summer, but they'll mostly be sort of study break videos, not finance, but playing games instead, because we're on break. At least the students are. We professors tend to not be really on break. But have a good summer, and hopefully I'll see you again in the fall. Happy study.